Hello, I'm Owen Cheng, a Chinese American living in New York City. I could walk to Chinatown from where I live in like 20 minutes, yet I've been to Chinatown maybe 4 times in my life. In later years, I fear that there may not be a Chinatown left, and this is that story. The sources I use are exclusively articles written by, interviews with, and photographs taken by Asian Americans. I figured this out by using the very in-depth research method known as looking at their last names. This is because the issue of Chinatown is one that affects Asian New Yorkers, not just Chinese New Yorkers, because Chinatown has long been a launching point for all immigrants from Asia. New York City's Chinatown has a rich history as one of the oldest ethnic enclaves in the country. However, NYC's Chinatown is currently facing an Asian population loss and cultural death as a result of gentrification. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story really begins in 1882. On May 6, 1882, the US government implemented the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first and only time that the US government could completely ban an ethnic group from entering the country. The act lasted 60 years, and during that time, immigration from China was incredibly limited. The Chinese Americans living in the country during this time period experienced heavy racial discrimination, and so many of them moved into urban environments around other immigrants, which then further pushed them into Chinatowns. Like other ethnic enclaves, New York City's Chinatown provided a safe space for immigrants to celebrate their culture without fear of discrimination. So by its very nature, Chinatown was founded on isolation and discrimination. The Chinese Americans living there were forced into Chinatowns out of necessity. Ironically, during the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese population within Chinatown actually increased in relation to the wider Chinese population of New York. Here's the thing about Manhattan's Chinatown, though. It sucks. The physical geographic location is great. It's rare for such a potent ethnic enclave to be so close to the heart of a city like New York. But the housing there are relic of New York City's Gilded Age. Small, cheap tenement apartments were all over New York City during the Gilded Age. The tenement apartments have their origins in racism, as during the Gilded Age, white families fled the cities to the surrounding suburbs in a phenomenon called white flight, leaving the immigrants in the urban areas, which consisted of cramped tenement houses that prioritized the quantity of tenants over their quality of life. Many of these 100-year-old tenement houses still persist in New York City to this day, and there are tons of them in Chinatown. So, Chinese immigrants are forced into these shitty tenements, and when I say shitty, I mean really shitty. Many of these apartments lack elevators, windows, and sprinklers, and some of them have exposed wire, missing smoke detectors, and blocked passageways. And a lot of these tenements violate housing codes. Also, these tenements are horribly maintained, but there's nothing many of these tenants can do about it, with lots of these immigrants having nowhere else to go. In February of 2009, Ling, an Asian photographer, lived in a tenement house in Chinatown which caught fire. Her and her roommate barely escaped, and 200 people lost their homes that day. Later, city records revealed that many of these apartments featured numerous housing violations. Ling has since taken photographs of these tenements to portray the living conditions of Chinese New Yorkers every day. These apartments heavily deter younger immigrants from returning to Chinatown, as well as pave the way for luxury raising. As a result of the awful living conditions in the tenements, New York City has offered to raze older buildings in favor of building luxury hotels for wealthier families in Chinatown. So basically, the city is using these tenement apartments as an excuse to tear down buildings in Chinatown so they can build luxury housing. There's actually a word for this. But we'll get back to this because there's more to the story. On September 11th, 2001, 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center in an act of terrorism, and just 10 blocks away, Chinatown was blanketed in ash and debris. National Guard troops as well as police officers moved in to prevent any vehicle movement in or out of Chinatown. In one day, what was once a tourist hotspot was put on complete lockdown, similar to the COVID-19 quarantine. The streets were empty. Businesses slowed to a standstill. There was mass unemployment. Subways skipped stops in Chinatown. Many factories were outsourced to areas other than Chinatown and never returned. The area became known as the Frozen Zone. 9/11 put an estimated 75% of Chinatown's residents out of work. Not only did many businesses close and never return, but there has been since over-policing in Chinatown. To this day, Chinatown has never reverted to its former glory. During 9/11, Park Row, a primary road that leads in and out of Chinatown, was closed down because it was so close to the police headquarters. Today's date is May 28, 2022, and Park Row has not been reopened. The first few years it was okay, then 5 years passed, then 10 years, but we never thought it would still be closed off. Nancy Kwong. Additionally, Chinatown still has police occupation, which scares off immigrants. Imagine you are a Chinese immigrant in Chinatown who may not even speak English very well, who is thinking about moving into Chinatown or is already living in Chinatown, and you see drug-sniffing dogs around the area. You'll perceive the area as pretty unsafe and maybe dangerous. Not only does police occupation in Chinatown intimidate immigrants, but it also contributes to Chinatown's bad image problem. Because of the over-policing, New Yorkers generally perceive Chinatown as dangerous, because why else would there be so many police in an area that's supposed to be safe? After 9/11, Chinatown lost its vibrancy. In the past, Chinatown was a bustling place for immigrants and white tourists to visit. Now, New York City's Chinatown is a shadow of its former self, meaning less Chinese immigrants want to live there, especially the second-generation immigrants who grew up speaking English and are less dependent on Chinatown. If you were a second-generation Chinese immigrant who grew up in Chinatown, why would you want to go back? There's over-policing and cramped tenement apartments. It is this image problem that also contributes to Chinatown's increased isolation from the rest of New York City, because how a place is perceived has tangible effects on the people. Businesses in Chinatown failed for two reasons: its isolation from the rest of the city and the post-9/11 stagnation which killed many of its businesses. It only makes sense. If people perceive Chinatown as dangerous and an undesirable place, they probably won't shop there. If they don't shop there, the town's businesses suffer. Additionally, the Asian population of Chinatown has also been taking a hit, so even the local Chinese immigrants don't shop at these businesses. As a result, the locally owned businesses of Chinatown, whether they be Chinese restaurants, laundromats, or corner stores, are all suffering. During the time when Chinatown was frozen, post 9/11, local businesses stopped getting customers and most businesses didn't recover. During the years following 9/11, the AA Federation recorded that the number of garment factories decreased 57%, 43% of Chinatown's restaurants reported revenue loss, Chinatown's largest industry, retail trade, decreased 2%, and employment dropped 6%. When locally owned Chinese businesses suffer, so too does the wider community. If people don't think that they can start a business in Chinatown, they simply won't live in Chinatown. This further contributes to the decreased Asian population in Chinatown. New York City's Chinatown is one of the few places in New York City experiencing a significantly high churn rate of Asian residents. The churn rate is the rate at which a group of people leaves an area. With poor living conditions, failing businesses, and over-policing, of course Chinese immigrants are moving out. Many Chinese immigrants are moving further out of the city, with Flushing and Sunset Park acting as pseudo-second Chinatowns. From 2000 to 2006, the Chinese population in Chinatown remained stagnant, while the Chinese population of Sunset Park increased 27%, and the population of Flushing increased 55%. The result of Chinese immigrants leaving Chinatown is an influx of wealthier residents as they build luxury housing. Remember, Chinatown is a rather desirable part of Manhattan, so wealthy groups would move in there given they had the luxury housing. Remember when I was talking about tenements and luxury raising earlier and said, we'll get back to this? Well, we're getting back to it. Again, luxury raising presents the problem of destroying Chinese people's homes and displacing them out of Chinatown. The decreased Chinese population in Chinatown just makes it easier for luxury raising projects to happen. This is, plain and simple, gentrification of Chinatown. The gentrification of the area will push the Asian immigrants out of Chinatown, likely into the surrounding New York City area. But why should these people who lived in Chinatown for generations be forced to move to Flushing or Sunset Park? The result of the gentrification of Chinatown is a less central Chinese cultural heart in New York City. Why can't Chinatown be the center of Manhattan? Why must it be pushed to the outskirts of the city? It's somewhat rare for an ethnic enclave to be so close to the center of the city, and with Chinatown already having a bad image problem, Chinese culture is being further removed from the public eye. This is Chinese cultural death. Chinese cultural death is a direct result of gentrification. When one of the oldest Chinatowns in the country gets gentrified, the Chinese cultural potency will die with it. Bustling streets and markets and lanterns and bright colors and food will all just become standard urban area, soulless. It is our culture that humanizes us to the rest of the world. Someone would be less inclined to commit a hate crime on a group when the victim has their beautiful culture on display, which leads me to my final point. Anti-Asian hate is spurred from a lack of understanding of culture. When a group isn't allowed to celebrate its culture, it becomes easier to be seen as less human. Humans have culture. If you can stop a group from celebrating their culture, you can stop people from seeing them as fully human. You think that discrimination and racism is only present in southern and rural areas or white suburbias, but they are more than commonplace in urban areas. Just this year, for Chinese New Year, 5 of my friends and I took a trip down to Boston. 3 of us are Chinese, 1 of us is Filipino, 1 of us is Korean, and 1 of us is Japanese. We arrived in Chinatown and ate lunch, saw some stores and got bubble tea. We wanted to get Korean barbecue for dinner, so we slowly made our way down to the KBBQ place over the course of the day. Not only did we notice a distinct change once exiting Boston's Chinatown, but we also were outside of Chinatown for only 30 minutes before we walked by some lady who muttered under her breath, "I've never seen this many fucking Chinese people in my life." 3 of us aren't Chinese! Now, we laughed it off, determined to have a good time that day, because we were just visitors. But you can see how a permanent Chinese resident may have taken that more seriously. I joked that next time it happened, we should yell back. Luckily, I only had to wait another 2 hours before it happened again. Some mother was walking beside us and said to her daughter, "Walk behind me, these people don't know how to walk in this country." Naturally, we turned around and yelled to defend our status as Americans. These 2 encounters happened in the span of only a few hours, and in New York City, there are plenty of accounts of anti-Asian violence, to the point where my sisters have been too afraid to take the subway after COVID-19 related violence hit the news. I interviewed Wellington Chen a few months ago, and he recounted his story of watching a man who pulled out an 8-inch butcher knife and stabbed an Asian lady. Mr. Chen stressed that nobody carries an 8-inch butcher knife around, which is kind of true, and that man had an intent to kill a Chinese person. There's no good way to stop Asian hate. People will always feel prejudice. But one way to lessen Asian hate and violence is cultural celebration. Cultural celebration works. With the advent of K-pop and K-dramas, Korean culture has been way more popular in the West. As a result, Korean-owned businesses in New York City have received more business. In New York City, people go to Koreatown for the food, for the products, and for the experiences, because K-pop and Koreatown don't have the same image problem as Chinatown. If Chinese culture were to be celebrated more, there would be less anti-Chinese violence, as well as more foot traffic in the Chinatown area. To combat the poor living conditions of tenement housing, there's an organization called Habitat for Humanity. This organization will help to build better housing and financially support these Chinese immigrants in Chinatown. The link to the donation is in the description. Please donate. Well, here we are at the end of the video. For you, it's been 12 minutes, but for me, it has literally been 12 hours of writing and editing and recording. Not writing, actually. The writing was not factored into that 12 hours. It is 6 a.m. I had a lot of fun researching this project. It's something that I found I very much care about, and I really hope that I can make a difference. This microphone is not plugged into anything. I couldn't get it to work. And yeah, thank you for watching.